Hi everyone, welcome to, I suppose this is a series variant, for want of a better word. So, I suppose well over a year ago now, I did a series called Albums That Shaped Me. So I've decided to resurrect that series in a slightly different form, at least do like a 10 video run of it. And I'm going to call it something like Albums That Made Me, just to signify it's slightly different, even though it comes from the same sort of sentiment. But the format is going to be slightly different. And really, I suppose it came about because I'd noticed that on one or two occasions I'd noticed through my statistics for the sort of YouTube analysis stuff, that I was getting some views on older videos from that series, and so I thought it piqued my interest. And then in preparation for putting together, which I'm now going to put off for a while until I finish this run of 10 videos, but I was carrying on with my Musing on series for albums by doing the 2000s. And as I picked around in there, getting ready for a potential 2000s episode, this album, In Flames, came up, which I had previously covered in a Joy of the Rediscovered Albums episode. And it made me think back as to what a big impact this album had on my listening environment, my listening experience, I suppose, and where that took me, and how it shaped my sort of musical preferences, or broadened my musical preferences, nudged them on a little bit more. Because I had originally, back in the early 90s, been aware of and bought several albums by original sort of death metal bands from like the Florida scene, and for various reasons, I suppose my interest in heavy music around the, I would say, middle-ish, probably sort of sometime around 93 into 95, 95, 96. So about from about 93 to 96, my interest in heavier music waned a little bit, and so I wasn't really keeping up with that explosion, I suppose, in the 90s, where all of these subgenres of metal emerged. And so, there was a load of stuff I sort of missed out on. And then what happened was, and I think I've told this story multiple times, is sometime, and I think it was the very first, well, it would have been early 97, I picked up a copy of Terrorizer, which I think I'd actually even at some point had bought the very first issue of that and then promptly sort of forgotten about it. And then sometime by January, I suppose, it must have been of 97, I noticed an issue of it in a local newsagents and bought it, and it was the end of year chart issue. So, what they normally do is say, like January time of the following year, whatever issue comes out there, they publish a end of year best of for the previous year. So, January 97, they're publishing 96 end of year chart. And that was really sort of what clued me back in. And there were a lot of bands in that year that I never checked out. So like Typo Negative, October Rust was released in 96, Godflesh, Songs of Love and Hate, Neurosis Through Silver in Blood, Swan, Soundtracks for the Blind, Tool, Enema, I don't know how you pronounce that, Enema, Samuel's Passage and so on. Also things like Arch Enemy's Black Earth, which we'll get onto in a moment, and Third and the Mortal, Painting and Gloss. So it's pretty diverse. And I literally worked my way through that end of year list over the course of about 10 years, slowly acquiring every single CD that was in that. It was a top 30 back on, and they expanded over time. So every year I check out the releases, and generally I'd always do it retrospectively. So I'd wait for the chart to come out, and then I'd buy the albums from the previous year, or the albums I wanted to buy. And I think, the 96 one is the only one where I've systematically gone through and managed to buy all the albums. Of course, now, after that 10-year period, it's a bit of a moot point, really, because sometime in the late 2010s, the late 2000s, we get into the area of streaming services, and so that's a bit of a moot point now. Now I can look through previous back issues of Terrorizer and listen to whatever albums I like to my heart's content. But it was a bigger deal back then in terms of you had to really think about the albums you were buying. So I was using that as my yardstick anyway. Sometime in the late 90s, after I'd bought several issues year on year, I think I'd consistently bought every issue over the course of about probably 10 or so years. And about, I say, 2-3 years in, I started to buy more stuff from the review section. And this was one album. And so that's where I was going with this story. So this basically, I remember buying this after reading a review of it and being completely blown away, as I think I spoke about I featured it in a previous episode of the Joy of the Rediscovered Albums series. And but I wanted to talk about it again in a slightly different context. So what we're going to do is we're going to go through, and this new format, I've got some tools that I put together to sort of help me act as like a second brain. So I deliberately avoided putting loads and loads of Wikipedia tags up like I would normally do. And we're going to fly a little bit by the seat of our pants for this pilot episode and see whether that actually works as a format. Full disclosure, I've got a few notes off to the side, but just because there were certain, I did a dry run of this, and there were certain albums where I just wanted to get the dates right in my head for when I'm sort of talking about stuff lining up with the genre, without having to read through every single article. So the point I'm making, I suppose, is this album was my gateway back into a genre that I was already sort of aware of. And the reason why I was sort of aware of it is in sometime after 97, but before this album, I bought Arch Enemy's Black Earth, and that was in the 1996 end of year Terrorizer. The very first album I actually bought off of that from that end of year chart was actually My Dying Bride's Like Gods of the Sun, and they're more of a doom death band, but that'll factor into the discussion in a moment. We'll see some interesting collections and crossovers between melodic death metal and doom death, no doubt. So as I've sort of, just to recap, early 90s, I started listening to bands like Death and Morbid Angel and Obituary, and then don't really keep up, and then check out Black Earth sometime between 97 and the end of the millennium, and didn't Bite, and I was trying to work out why at that point I didn't really go crazy over that album. I mean, I bought Black Earth, and a couple of years later I bought the third album by Arch Enemy, and enjoyed it, but still didn't fully go down this particular sort of rabbit hole, fully embrace it. And I think what it was I got distracted by the My Dying Bride album, like Gods of the Sun, and then sometime 97, 98 I went down a really huge UK Peaceville 3 rabbit hole. So 3 bands I'm talking about: My Dying Bride, Anathema, and Paradise Lost. And I bought like Gods of the Sun by My Dying Bride. That opened up a whole side quest with them, and going back and getting into their earlier albums, and also some of their later stuff as it was released. Anathema, the Step On album would have been a little bit later, and that would have been Judgment. And I did a similar thing with them, went backwards, went forwards little bit with them. And then, like over the course of the 2000s, and then Paradise Lost would have been 1 second, but I only went backwards with them. I didn't really go forwards. So I think what happened was I'd fallen into this doom death chasm, and that distracted me, along with a few other things that piqued my interest in 96 as well. Like I went on a bit of a Cradle of Filth jag as a result of hearing Dusk and Her Embrace for a little while. So yeah, I was distracted by that, and also Catatonia, Brave Murder Day came out in 96, and so there was I had a bit of a side jag to the jag. Was a sort of doom metal into gothic, which again Paradise Lost had sort of touched on through the album Gothic. So there was all this sort of cross pollination. And it can get quite complicated. The other thing you'll tend to notice with a lot of these bands in this area, because they seem to be naturally progressive in their tendencies musically, they do tend to mutate over time. We'll see that in a moment. So 2000, I start to think, I should really check out this genre. And so I buy this album, and if we go on to their their timeline, and then I buy this, which is also really good. So both of these albums are really good, but I didn't take it much further with this band, because I then ended up going down another rabbit hole, and we'll talk a bit through the aid of my various tools I have now about where this band took me, which is really the point of these episodes, is to sort of look at, okay, what was I listening at the time in the same, roughly the same ballpark, musically, genre-wise, and then going, okay, sometimes there's a bit of a false start. You realise after you really fully embrace a genre or a band that you were sort of being softened up several years before, but you never really took the bait, so to speak. So I listened to these 2 albums. Now, I have seen In Flames live, but I didn't see them until a lot later. I saw them in 2013 in Halifax, Nova Scotia. I'd moved to Halifax, Nova Scotia in the end of 2009. And despite going to a lot of metal gigs in over a number of years, particularly there was an intense period from about at the end of the 2000s. So there was quite an intense period at the beginning of the 2000s and quite an intense period at the end of the 2000s. And so when I came to Nova Scotia, that carried on. There were a lot of metal bands touring and playing in Halifax in the early to mid 2000s. Sadly, it sort of fell off, and I've been lucky as a consequence to see a lot of really top-notch bands. I mean, I got to see Opiath again after seeing them in the UK in 2008, I think it was. I saw them again in Halifax sometime in the early to mid the mid 2010s. Yeah, that's right. So it's here. So, you know, completely different lineup to when I first listened to them, which is here. And you can probably see, to me, like, I don't know if you can use the term classic lineup for this band, because there's been quite a number of iterations of the band, but this was a good run for the band members wise. I think this sort of chunk here, well, maybe here, yeah, maybe here, because they did change guitarists here. So yeah, this chunk here, it's up until Jesper Strombold leaves the band. Interesting enough, found a member, and it's one of these bands, and there are a few now, because a lot of bands are getting on in years, where there's no original members from the first album. So this was Lunar Strain, which was released in 1994. And yeah, so Jesper Strombold leaves, was around 2010. So yeah, I never got to see the band with him in the band. When I saw it was a later iteration here. But there are two members still in the band that have been around since that would be the second album and the first EP, I suppose. Yeah. But you can see there's quite a lot of changes in the band, and a lot of people doing sort of double duty in various things as well. But this, you know, this period here is the early days of melodic death metal, particularly as we'll see in Sweden. And there are, if you look at sort of the history of the band, there are three bands who tend to come up, and including, you know, In Flames. We've got At the Gates, Dark Tranquillity. So, just to put a sort of pin in the timeline, if you go into At the Gates, that would have been, their debut album would have been 93, and it would have been, I think it's With Fear I Kissed the Burning Darkness. I always tend to call it The Burning Sky for some reason, but it's With Fear I Kissed the Burning Darkness. Dark Tranquillity had Sky Dancer out in 93, and then In Flames release Lunar Strain as their debut album. So 93 into 94. First album by Arch Enemy comes out in 96, as you saw. And that's going to be important in a moment when we look at all these really interesting interconnections, because there's a connection back to Carcass. And often it's this album, which came out in 93, but when you listen to this album, yeah, it's definitely, you can hear the leading in through that. So they've gone through a number of changes from, I suppose, what you would call grindcore, through, you know, death metal, technical death metal, into melodic death metal. And in the band, in that transition from those sort of two albums, so if we go from this album, where are we? I'm just double checking, yeah. So Michael Hammer, who ends up in, well, I was thinking of him as being Arch Enemy, who I also got to see twice in the course of about a year. So you can see already we're getting some interesting sort of cross pollination going on here. So we've got, you know, Carcass doing their sort of move into more melodic stuff, from going from sort of pretty harsh stuff, as they move into 93, and then you'd have to sort of check the backstory because I'm purely thinking of this as a listener, but it'd be interesting to read about like how much Carcass, those Swedish death metal bands had been consuming. I'm assuming it was quite a bit because they were a well-known band within the extreme sort of metal ecosystem. Now, sadly, I never got a chance to see Carcass live. So, to help me out a little bit, let's just plug into this. I'm going to release, I don't know if I said already, I apologise if I'm repeating myself. After I finish the series, I am going to release the code for this in case anybody finds it useful. There'll probably be some other things by the time I finish the series. So, I've done a few episodes already about, how to interact with LLMs, so I'm not going to go down that rabbit hole for this. But let me grab In Flames as our starting point, seeing as they're the bands that was sort of responsible for getting me back into, or properly getting me into melodic death metal, and all other points there from there, I suppose. So this is basically just going away, and I've asked it in Gemini, using Google Gemini, to list 15 similar artists to In Flames. And it did it itself here. So yeah, there we go. Dark Tranquility, At the Gates, and yeah, obviously In Flames. So yeah, Arch Enemy. So the album, and I might as well bring it up. Where are we? Let's do it from here. Okay. So yeah, Black Earth. Now I'm not quite sure when I first read about this band, this album. Sorry, I don't quite know where they were going, like what the original plan was with the band. I'm sure if I was to dig deeper into their backstory, then I might be enlightened a little bit more. And it's interesting because I've just got myself a book on death metal, and it's something that even though I've had other books, like I think there was a book called Choosing Death, which I owned a copy of, I've never really fully explored in terms of the history, outside of listening to the albums, that is, of Swedish melodic death metal. Although I've listened to a lot of albums, I haven't really sort of done much of a factual exploration. So this episode in some ways was a way, I think, of me trying to finally get around to that. And I've recently bought a very interesting book in the 33 1/3 series, which once I've finished reading, I'll do a My Life in Objects episode on it. But yeah, there's a lot of crossover here in this band. I mean, yeah, all of these bands have really interesting members that you can go down just a whole rabbit hole for the individual members in terms of seeing who they've sort of been involved with, who their relatives are, all sorts of stuff like that. So Adrian Edlinson, yeah, Haunted, Cradle of Filth, Paradise Lost. Yeah, the list is endless. The end is listless, as I like to say sometimes. So in listening to In Flames again, I thought, well, I need to dig out or listening to In Flames in 2000, I started thinking, I need to start digging out listening to the Arch Enemy album that I bought a couple of years before that. And then subsequently, what happened was after I bought that first album, I did buy, was it Burning Bridges? That's it, Burning Bridges. Which is, where's it gone? It's difficult sometimes to see what's going on here. As I was trying to move away from using it. Wikipedia. It's a bit difficult when you're having discussions about this not to do that. So the third album, I bought that. So I bought those before I bought In Flames, and then I remember listening to them, a fair amount of time, but not bothering to go in that direction because there was so much other stuff as a result of my mind being blown by listening to, the albums off of, or working my way through the albums off of the 96 Terrorizer end of year list. That I didn't have the disposable income, I didn't have the inclination, I didn't have, there's a lot of I didn't have streaming music, those sort of things. I had a business to run. It was all sort of got in the way. Gigs to go to. So you can only push things so far. But in being completely blown away by the In Flames album, I then sort of pick up again on this stuff, start listening to it again and thinking, I really need to check out. So I actually end up retrospectively checking out Necrotism and then Heartwork, listening to that. So going out buying those albums. And then at some point, and they're on the list here no doubt, this band At the Gates, and you can probably guess what particular album that was, because I think for a lot of people this album, where has it gone? The one where they have success and then basically split up, Slaughter of the Soul, which comes out in 95. So this one I did buy, but not until after I'd bought that In the Gates album. The other interesting thing that sort of gets mixed into this is Dark Tranquillity. I remember checking them out on a what's their record label? Osmos, I think it was. Yeah. The period they were on Osmos, there was a sampler CD of 4 tracks given away with Terrorizer. I'm not talking about the 20 track things they used to do. This was one specifically from Osmos, and there was 4 tracks on there. One of them was a French band, and I wish I could remember their name because they sounded super interesting. They weren't a melodic death metal band. They were a little bit more slow, a bit slower. But I remember listening to that track, and that I listened to actually more than whatever Dark Tranquillity track was on there. And it was really Dark Tranquillity. I didn't listen to any of their stuff until, when would that be? I'm trying to think of my Step On album for them. It was a lot later. Is it The Mind's Eye? I think it might be. Yeah, because I've got the CD with both of these on. Yeah. So The Mind's Eye, which I bought sometime after I got into In Flames. So yeah, so I did end up buying albums by all of those three bands, but it was more of a retrospective purchase for both Dark Tranquillity and At the Gates. And then things get rather interesting because, as I think I mentioned, later in the 2000s, I went to see Arch Enemy twice, and with them it was pretty cool because both of the gigs they played, I primarily had gone, I mean, I wanted to go and see them, but I'd primarily gone to see other bands. So I saw them for this tour, and they supported Machine Head. So I went to this gig, this was or this tour, and I went to see them at Brixton Academy. So Machine Head, Trivium, Dragon Force, Shadows Fall. We were queuing so long outside. I don't know if anybody's ever been to a gig at Brixton Academy, but it just has unbelievably long queues to get in. And I think, this time, for this time, I went to see a band there. We missed most of Shadows Fall. Yeah, but did get to see Arch Enemy, and then, so that was 2007. Then in 2008, they recorded this DVD, which was bought to me a Christmas present one year, many years later, and it's an awesome DVD, actually, really good, from Tokyo. But I actually saw them on the Defenders of the Faith tour in 2008, April, so just after this was recorded, I suppose. Yeah. Supporting Opeth, and there was Devil Driver and 3 Inches of Blood, who I think I've seen 3 Inches of Blood at least twice now. Yeah. So that was pretty cool to see them twice in the course of a year, really. Yeah, August into March, and they were just awesome live. The only downside with the Brixton Academy is the sound there is not great, or whenever I've been, it's not been great. And I was really glad I got to see Opeth in Halifax a lot later in the 2010s, at in a venue where the acoustics were much better. And I think I saw Opeth with probably Catatonia actually at that point, so that was cool. And what then happened at the same time is with Opeth. So in my ears getting tweaked into this more sort of melodic death metal, into more progressive elements as well. So I go a bit proggy with that, and end up getting this album also in 2000. So I noticed it in the end of year, the 1999 end of year Terrorizers, which would have been in the 2000s, and sort of bought it sometime in the 2000s, around the same time as I bought the In Flames album on that. So it wasn't really until the 2000s that I started to preemptively buy a lot of stuff as it was released. I was sort of hedging my bets a bit and waiting until certain albums came up on the end of year lists. But yeah, In Flames was definitely one that I bought when it came out. What else have we got here? And so I can actually see a pattern emerging here, because we've got later melodic metalcore bands, or bands who would be associated with that. And when I went to see Machine Head in 2007, I remember at the same time as the Blackened album came out, I had a friend who was listening to Trivium a lot. Same person actually. I went to gigs. That went to the Machine Head gig, and didn't go to the Opeth gig with them, but I went to a whole load of others actually around that time. But yeah, I remember listening to Trivium and Killswitch, and who else here? I'm trying to think who I went to see, because then what happened was, and I was thinking about this today, it suddenly came to mind, is sometime it must have been 2008, there was that, was it called Summer Slaughter? But the one that plays Europe, yeah, this one. So these were more, this was an interesting lineup because it was a mixture of bands, and there was a bit of a, so yeah, Annotations of Autopsy are a British death metal band. The Berserker, oh yeah, and yeah, they were heavy. And I remember the time as Blood Runs Black, the drummer had left the band, and they were using different drummers from the other bands, and including, I think, the Berserker drummer for the majority of the set. And then it was, yeah, Suicide Silence was headline. That was, I was trying to remember who. So you can probably tell quite a lot of these bands have connections with like deathcore stroke metalcore. So a lot of them did feel a bit more like a deathcore band. But that's where I ended up going, sort of. So yeah, went sort of melodic death metal into metalcore into deathcore. Yeah, so that was, so you could say that In Flames album was a sort of gateway into me a lot of it was like, apart from the deathcore, like the metalcore stuff, I'd listened to, again, this would have been around about 1997. In the 1996 Terrorizer End of Year, which I keep going on about, there was an album in there by Earth Crisis called Tomorrow's Seasons Ends. And the trouble with the term metalcore is that it's one of those fluid terms where over time the metalcore sound has evolved quite a bit. So around the time of Gomorrah Season Ends, the Earth Crisis, it sounded to me, metalcore then sounded a bit like hardcore with Slayer melodic riffs, like Slayer riffs. That's what it made me think of, and that's what Earth Crisis reminded me of. But then over time, which is I think why they started using the term maybe melodic metalcore, because the bands got even more melodic. And so you had bands like Killswitch Engage, and I'm trying to think of the other band that I really got into around that time. Yeah. It's funny, I never listened to, there's a whole load of stuff I never listened to. Like I never listened to Children of Bodom. I did listen to The Haunted, but I found them much more aggressive. And I saw them some tour around the time of this one. But I just can't remember what tour it was. I'm trying to think who would have been headlining if it wasn't them, because I don't think it was. Yeah. But yeah, there's a lot of bands. This was pretty intense. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And they were all pretty heavy. I think up to that point, the most bands I'd seen were 5 on a bill. But what I was impressed with where there's a lot of bands on the bill, compared to some gigs I've been to where the changeovers really, what's the word? You get those big gaps. The changeover was really slick. The only time I've seen a slicker changeover is when I went to a small gig, and who was headlining? It was more of a hardcore show. Cancer Bats. I've got the. It's all right. I just realised I got the post on the wall. Yeah, May 2008, when they played in Brighton with Johnny Truant and Hexes, and there was another band as well on that bill, and I can't remember who it was. But yeah, Cancer Bats, Johnny Truant and Hexes, May 2008. That was literally just before my first trip out to Nova Scotia, actually. Yeah, so interesting sort of series of events, and like I said, with the metalcore rediscovery, it was I had listened to it, and I thought when I listened back to the metalcore around 2008, when I compare it to what I was listening to in '96, it was a bit of a shock. Actually, it was quite a big contrast. 96 metalcore is a lot more brutal, and then in between those sort of two periods, you've got bands like Hatebreed as well. Again, more of a metalcore band, and it's interesting as well with this sort of whole cross pollination between the melodic death metal, the metalcore, and the deathcore, and what the band's origins are. So you've got the bands we're originally talking about, like In Flames, Dark Tranquillity, who are growing out of like the European death metal scene, and prior to that, you've got bands like Entombed, I suppose. Yeah, Entombed. So let me just try. So we've got a number of different perspectives here to just help me maybe, or remind myself of bands that I may have forgotten about in the mists of time. This is definitely a band I need to properly check out. The Halo Effect, I believe, is isn't that the original member of In Flames? His new band, or newish band. I say new band because they're like a sort of super group of sorts, aren't they? Let's have a look. Yeah, Swedish melodic death metal band. There we go. Jesper Strombold. So that would have been an early vocalist from. I was also in Dark Tranquillity as well. Yeah. So this might be a little bit confusing. What this is doing is doing a Last FM search. So the previous one was using an LLM. This is just a Last FM API search. Top albums. I used to have a really cool one for Spotify, but it broke because Spotify no longer let you do searches on similar bands for some reason through their API, or at least the way I used to do it is broken. Last FM works fine. So, and the only problem with Last FM is I don't know how many people use the Scrobblers anymore, so this might be a little bit out of date because it's based on people that have downloaded and installed the Scrobbler or linked to it through Spotify, what stuff they played alongside other things, and also what stuff they played a lot. So there's Clayman number 2 on there, and these are just the top tracks irrespective of albums. Then I've got a sort of double search where in Last FM I get it to go through, come up with 10 similar bands, and then for those bands, their top album on Last FM, and then for those bands, their top track. So this isn't the top track from the album, it's just the top track by the band according to like Last FM, or worked out from Last FM scrobbling. This is another interesting band that I never got to check out. I'd always associated them with more as a death metal band that had tinges of Viking metal. But their name often comes up when talking about melodic death metal. Amorphous are an interesting band. I did listen to them, but I've always put them more in the sort of the progressive metal. There, I have this album, but I didn't buy it until what do I? Yeah, if I did buy it, it wouldn't have been till the late 2000s, or I listened to it on Spotify. Yeah, it's a number of different genres all mixed together, really. Don't know if I listened to that. That's their EP. Oh, this one, yeah. Death metal, death doom. So there's a good deal of cross-pollination going on with all of this. Yeah, there's another name that I've seen come up quite a bit. So it seems to me that what I did is I sort of stuck with the three, originators, for want of a better word, of the Swedish melodic death metal and Carcass, because I've bought a few Carcass albums since then and listened to, was it Surgical Steel and other stuff they've released, again through more streaming. And then, rather than go off down a full-on melodic death metal rabbit hole, I end up sort of veering off into melodic metalcore and then deathcore. So I think that's the upshot of this. And it is interesting when you go back and you try and think through your musical discovery patterns, which, as you know, I'm absolutely fascinated by. This is just a simple playlist that you can generate on Last.fm. I've only got 15 here. I think it can generate up to a list of 50. Again, look, My Curse. I remember going out and buying on Amazon. Again, I've mentioned this quite a few times, where sometime in the middle to late 2000s, people were just offloading all their CDs on Amazon, and I was buying up a ton of really decent second-hand CDs, and so buying 2 or 3 albums by Killswitch, various other bands as well. All the Remains are on the list here. I really need to probably check out this band. Although sadly now, of course, the guitarist and main driving force of the band died. So yeah. And then what we'll do, and on different weeks, depending on the complexity here of the genres, we'll look at certain multiple genres. So I created this interesting genre history. I'm going to turn the temperature. This temperature, if I hadn't mentioned already, so 0 is, so 1 is its most inventive, for want of a better word, when it's most likely to hallucinate, and 0 is least likely. On a lot of models, that's not always the case, but yeah. So let me probably do this, otherwise the LLM's probably going to freak out. Okay, so you'll see in a moment what I've got, like a curated prompt for this, so it doesn't just ask the so you can see what I do is I've taken the original genre and encapsulated it, if that's the right word here, inside of a series of questions. So key bands in the birth and evolution of melodic death metal. So at the gates, In Flames, Dark Tranquillity. Yeah, so I think on this list, the bands I'd most like to listen to that I haven't listened to is Soilworks, Children of Bodom, and then the bottom 3 here. All the other ones I've listened to. This is always interesting because it's doing a pretty good job here, I think. I recognise all of these. The Insomnium one, I'm not sure of, but I've had it on occasions with when you get LLMs to make actual specific suggestions about specific albums or tracks. It does have a habit of hallucinating. Now, you're less likely to get that when you set the temperature to 0. And we'll try it with the temperature of 1 in a moment. These look all legit. But I don't know about, the trouble is I don't know about some of these. And I don't know if I want to look them up. So, yeah. But it was pretty amusing. I did one along similar lines. I'm having better luck with this, but I did one along similar lines with another large language model. I can't remember which one. And it was hallucinating left, right and centre. I did it for trip hop, and also asking about another genre. And yeah, it was just merging bands with album names and all sorts of crazy, wacky things. So yeah, major genre influences on melodic death metal, cultural factors, key events in the history, and then 6 earlier bands or artists influenced melodic death metal. Over time, what I'm hoping to do with this is develop a sort of bit more of a, what they call them, RAG, like a retrieval augmentation, where it generates questions and then uses the questions to dig down, from using the answers, uses the answers to dig down further, and then summarizes everything it's done. So that's where I'm sort of going with this over time. And this is always fascinating. So I would say at some point I've listened to all of these bands actually. I was going to say Entombed, certainly. But Celtic Frost went on quite a heavy jag with them all through the late 80s into the 90s. Iron Maiden. I know they're obviously cited as a major influence on melodic death metal because of the sort of introduction of those sort of 2 guitar melody lines, which maybe had been slightly lacking in some other bands, but not necessarily. I mean, Death took an interesting sort of line, and in fact, I think by the time you got onto their 2nd or 3rd album, they're getting into that territory. Although they became a bit more of, I suppose, a technical death metal band, if you're sort of splitting hairs here, they certainly, swum very close, if not into that pool. Yeah. Judas Priest. I mean, there's a lot of these bands that are going to be. The other band or guitarist that I think particularly I find I hear a lot in Arch Enemy, and it's more of a guitarist rather than necessarily a band, and that's in the solos, and that is definitely Michael Schenker. And the other guitarist I find that has a super melodic guitar sound is he played in Obituary as well as Death. The band. Where are they? James Murphy. Where was it? Yeah. James Murphy. Played in Death, Testament, Cancer, Disincarnate. The working on the Death album he played is awesome, I think. Yeah, Spiritual Healing. Yeah. So that was sort of my evolution with Death. Evolution with Death. Leprosy into Spiritual Healing into Human. Yeah. So to me, around this time, they're definitely sounding like super melodic, even though they're not being referred to in that form. And then they go into sort of more of a tech death jag. I can't remember if I am symbolic or not. Oh, I need to listen to the later stuff. That's one thing I've not really listened to them. There's a whole, I mean, this is the problem I face, and probably a lot of people out there, is you reach a point in a particular genre, particularly one that's as vast as extreme, the whole metal genre, all the subgenres. There are certain decades where everything just exploded, and that to me was like in the 90s, and there's a whole load of stuff because I went off down a bit of a sort of UK rock, sort of Britpop with elements, I suppose, of shoegaze and trip hop as well, in the sort of mid-90s, is there were like tons of bands in the 90s which I didn't get to listen to until a lot later, like Cathedral, and a whole slew of other bands actually. And as a consequence, I sort of was so behind that I just financially couldn't catch up. But now, with streaming, I've got no excuse, I suppose. So, and I've got this copy that Terrorizer did of like the 1990s in extreme music, and I really need to systematically go through that issue and pull apart the playlists and check out all those bands either I stopped listening to in the like Death in the relatively early 90s, and Obituary, I suppose, but also whole loads of bands in various other subgenres which I never got around to listening to. A lot of like the hardcore and crossover bands, who completely completely blindsided me in many ways. Because for me, it's sort of, I went from listening to, in terms of extreme music, I went from sort of, new wave of British heavy metal into thrash, but also being interested in some of the sort of early, glam, the heavier glam metal bands. And so into thrash, and then into death metal, and then a bit of a bit of a pause there, and then sort of back in. But when I got back in 96, 97, there was just so much stuff. I mean, I just looked down this list from 96, and got like I said, Typo Negative, Godflesh, Neurosis, Swans, Tool, Sam Neill, Earth Crisis, Sepultura, Fu Manchu, Corrosion of Conformity, The Third and the Mortal, Cradle of Filth, Labach, Korn, Catatonia, Gehenna. That's the black metal Gehenna, not the sort of beer metal Gehenna. Turmoil, Crowbar, Bloodlet, Downset, Stuck Mojo, so on. So yeah, and there we have it. I think I'm going to stop there. I've thoroughly enjoyed this, but I think I need to maybe tweak the format a little bit on there. I certainly want to carry on developing some of these, and because they act great. I mean, I'm looking into this as a second brain concept, where I don't want to necessarily use get bogged down in Wikipedia articles, and so maybe I need to start tweaking this so I can get it to sort of pull in summaries from maybe Wikipedia. That would be cool, actually, because I can definitely know how to do Wikipedia captures. So yeah, maybe I need to do some shenanigans there. Okay, thanks once again for watching. Bye for now, and I will catch you in a future episode.